In October of 1992, TriStar Pictures announced an acquisition deal for the rights to Godzilla with the intent to create a trilogy of films for the American market that was a new spin on the original concept. John DeBont was set to direct with a story by Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio, and a new Godzilla design by the famed special makeup effects legend Stan Winston. But, due to a series of complications and snafus that I detail in another video, those plans unfortunately fell through. TriStar, however, wasn't totally lost, and the idea wasn't entirely scrapped when the director-producer duo of Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich entered the scene and were set to headline the new direction for The King of Monsters. And 20 years ago, on May 20th, 1998, the United States got to see the fruits of all that labor. Hey watchers, how's it going? Will here with a special retro review for you of the 1998 film Godzilla from the makers of Independence Day and Stargate. This movie in particular holds a special, nostalgic place in my heart, as it was the first Godzilla film I ever saw. Some people may see that as near heresy, but this interpretation of the character did act as sort of a backdoor introduction for me to watch more of the original Japanese films that would not only inspire it, but also learn from and follow its legacy. So, I'm here to do a somewhat brief, very spoilery synopsis of a movie that should be turning 20 at the time this video is uploaded. Then I'll do some pros and cons of it. Now to that synopsis. During the 1960s off the coast of French Polynesia, a series of military nuclear tests are being conducted. But, unbeknownst to the humans, there is a nearby marine iguana nest that ends up being exposed to the radioactive effects of the blast. Flash forward to 1998, where a Japanese vessel carrying a large quantity of fish is suddenly attacked by some unseen aquatic menace. One of the survivors is investigated by a Frenchman but can only respond with the word Godzilla, a portmanteau of the Japanese words for gorilla and whale, gorira and kujira respectively. Enter Dr. Nick Tatopoulos, a man cursed not just with a name difficult for the other characters to pronounce, but also with the job of studying the effects of radioactivity on worms that live in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. He gets removed from his work and reassigned by the US State Department to study a case of a destroyed Japanese fishing vessel. The military concludes that there is a dinosaur loose and on the move, of which he is of course initially very dismissive because, the dinosaurs were struck with a case of the wiped out by a meteor millions of years ago, so rightfully so, he's skeptical. He is still curious as the skin sample he found does have its origin from an unknown, or in this case, yet to be discovered species. Meanwhile in New York, the monster makes its debut as it runs through the city leaving chaos and destruction in its wake, nearly killing Victor, Animal, Pilati, a cameraman who is friends with a wannabe news reporter and worst character of the film, Audrey Timmons. I'll get back to her. The military works to evacuate the island city, and in their pursuit of Godzilla, they end up causing more destruction than he does because the giant lizard has managed to disappear on the island of Manhattan, somehow, and mastered the ancient martial art of getting out of the way when missiles are fired at it. Tatopoulos, in having a coincidental run-in with his former ex-girlfriend Audrey, discovers that Godzilla is not just eating for one, but also seems to be stockpiling for its children, meaning that it is housing a nest somewhere and has reproduced asexually. He figures this out with a pregnancy test made for humans. Audrey ends up trying to spin his secret information for her own credibility, but in the process gets Nick kicked off the military assignment and she loses her story too to her boss. Tatopoulos isn't jobless for long though, as he is kidnapped by the Frenchman we were introduced to at the start of the film, a man named Philippe, who is a member of the French Secret Service and wants to destroy Godzilla and remove any evidence that the French were involved in its creation. Godzilla has a second run-in with the military where he is bombarded by torpedoes and implied to be dead as he floats off into the bottom of the Hudson. All the while, Nick and Philippe establish a strike team with an intent to find and destroy the nest, which is discovered to be inside Madison Square Garden. During the secret infiltration, they are also secretly followed by Audrey and Animal into the garden nest and see that the entire area is filled with eggs that begin hatching left and right. The majority of the strike team is killed as Nick, Philippe, Audrey, and Animal make a broadcast about the impending threat and require an Air Force bombing of the garden, making it out just in time in a dramatic, fiery fashion which is one of the true byproducts of a great 90s film. But, lo and behold, Godzilla has survived, and upon seeing the corpse of one of his children and realizing what happened there, understandably gets upset and goes on a rampage against humanity. Our four leads are chased throughout the city in a taxi and manage to trap the angered monster in the Brooklyn Bridge, where it is struck down via Air Force and dies, to the celebration of the denizens of the state. Our characters celebrate, the day is won, hooray. And the film closes on a stinger of a single surviving egg hatching. which eventually leads into the cartoon, which was intended to be a whole sequel movie, but that video has already been done as well. So, on to the pros. There is good build-up to the character, with him making a semi-full reveal within the first 30 minutes of the film, and he ends up consistently appearing and playing a role over the course of the movie. Also, although the characters do have their issues, they are a little bit distinct, which can help them be a little more memorable after watching the film, so you may not exactly remember their names, except for Nick Totopoulos.
That's a lot of fish!
But you do remember who they were and essentially what they ended up contributing. Although I prefer the Stan Winston design for the direction they took and the interpretation of this character, I am really fond of this design, but that's because in general I prefer Godzilla with a little bit more of a reptilian look to him, so that really comes down to personal preference. The accompanying score is actually pretty fitting to the scene-by-scene playouts that show tension, remorse, action, and even just casual activity, with the sprinkles of the soundtrack in there with the peak 90s like Rage Against the Machine, P. Diddy, and Jamiroquai. Now, on to the cons. Considering this movie is from 20 years ago, I have to cut it some slack, but yeah, some of the effects and some of the CGI can be kind of rough in this movie, so it hasn't exactly aged the best. And though I mentioned the human characters are memorable, that does not really mean that they are all good, and here is where my issue with Audrey comes in. Audrey is, subjectively, the worst character in this movie because she uses the old open wound and confusion from an 8-year lost ex-boyfriend to try and get her leg up in her own career. It's incredibly selfish and they try to play it off like he can forgive her, but you kind of empathize more with Nick, who got rejected when he proposed to his longtime girlfriend, who later vanished and then manipulated him to try and get a story. And while we're on Nick, looking back at it, Matthew Broderick seems to have been kind of miscast in this role, in my opinion, which also reflects some of the weaker aspects of the script too in terms of his character. It seems like the writers wanted to make this kind of a mashup character of a geeky nerd who's into something way deeper than he expects, but also making him a bit of a proactive force against Godzilla. Broderick's portrayal is supposed to make some line deliveries sound like a revelation, but they end up kind of falling flat, which means that the script still could have used a little bit of tweaking. It's a shame that Ian Ziering's legacy will be eternally tied to the Sharknado franchise, when he probably would have not only been a better fit for the live-action movie, but also what the character became in Godzilla the series, where he takes over the role of Totopoulos. While we're on writing, the movie does have a lot of notes from other Roland Emmerich titles, most notably Stargate and Independence Day, with the whole use of the military against some unknown force, the geeky main character, the heavy use of explosions before Michael Bay took that crown. By 1998, these tropes had already become quite evident for their team. And my last point is that Godzilla seems to have a kind of scaling problem, which gets worse if you include the marketing for this film like signs and such that would say his head is as big as the sign, or his foot is as big as his bus. Godzilla's size seems to be kind of fluctuating in certain scenes to serve purpose to the development of the plot. So, all in all, does this film hold up even upon its 20th birthday? For the most part, I would say yes, and I'm going to try and keep most of my nostalgia goggles off for this. The opening is actually very creative to show the backstory to Godzilla's, well, creation, and the build-up to what he is. It still comes across as pretty solid. Even when he starts rampaging across the city, for the most part, the effects do look at least okay or tolerable, and Godzilla maintains a consistent role in being the focus of the film, while the movie attempts to develop the characters who have to solve this problem. The problem is, at the end of the day, this is not Godzilla. This is more like a lizard lord or a king iguana. It has a similar backstory to Godzilla, but this is a giant animal, confusedly running around New York City, trying to stay alive and feed its kids. By the end of the movie, I wasn't really excited when he got killed, I just kind of felt bad for him. Godzilla to me always felt like a force or a commentary or a byproduct of war and showing the ugly realities that humanity had to offer, and as much as I love Zilla as his own character, and especially what he became in his follow-ups, this interpretation of Godzilla does not represent or feel like any of that. Zilla Jr. was actually much closer, as it was an animal with a conscience that wanted to protect Earth and keep his adopted father alive, which, to their credit, Zilla is actually pretty smart. He dodges missiles, he hides in plain sight, he even makes surprise attacks on the military. Even in the end, he jumps over part of the bridge because he knows he won't fit, only for him to not do that exact thing, and that ends up being his untimely downfall. I would still recommend giving it a chance and then checking out the follow-up series, which is infinitely better, but this is still a fun 90s monster flick, so it serves its purpose fine. All in all, this film would have worked way better under a different name, cause I can see him as a king, but in the end, he is nothing close to a god. Anyways, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel, Hybrid Network, check out our website and Patreon for more exclusive content, and hit that bell to be notified for new videos. I'm Will, and I'll see you next time.